Okay, I just wanted to make a quick video to go over a couple of common mistakes that students make, or that I see students making an awful lot when they're analyzing arguments in philosophy class. Particularly, my class is the way I go about teaching some of this stuff. Um, there are just a couple mistakes that are common for students to make. Um, Maybe they don't understand everything all the way, or something like that. So, just wanted to make a quick video to help out here. So the first mistake um, has to do with basic vocabulary, and this is kind of a big red flag mistake. So the second mistake I'm going to go over is more easy to understand, but the first one is not such a great thing to be occurring. And so here are some example assignment and exam questions from the class. I don't want to fall into the trap of teaching the test and teaching people just how to take tests. But given how I set up some of the assignments, I guess maybe I need to go over a few things here. Want to focus mostly on teaching the material, not teaching how to take an exam, right? But nevertheless, we do have exams and assignments, and people want to do well on them. And there's some common mistakes that are being made here. So let's go over a few of these here. So again, here are some examples of exam or assignment questions. According to the objection not A, what premise or premises in the argument for A is incorrect? What lines in the following argument, if any, are self-defeating or self-contradictory? You might be asked to formulate an argument for a position that you believe is relatively free of any major errors of fact, fallacy, or self-contradiction. And then another kind of question is, does the argument contain any factual errors, fallacies, or self-contradictions, right? And so I've bolded here all of the basic, like, kind of key vocabulary terms that are used in both a lot of the material that we read, really throughout the material that we read, in my lectures, and that pop up in instructions on assignments and questions in assignments. These are all terms that are basic vocabulary terms for us. In the first two readings, those two terms are discussed explicitly, defined explicitly, and referenced throughout. One AI check on the first two readings that I often use said that the term argument was used 89 times, including in the citations. So it's probably less in the actual text than that, but you get the point that that's a term that's used throughout the readings, right? So if you're failing to understand what an argument is, it's a pretty big red flag that you're not doing the reading, or that there's a reading comprehension issue that maybe we could get you some help with, right? So again, terms like argument, reasoning, premise, conclusion, fallacy, contradiction, etc., are explicitly defined and referenced throughout our readings. So if you're missing questions because you don't understand what those mean, then that's a problem. So for example, sometimes I asked at the beginning of the semester what an argument is, and students say it's a debate between two people, but that's not how argument is used in the readings. That's not how I explicitly teach it in the lecture. And so when people come up with the definition that I say is not the one that we mean when they're answering the question, it's a pretty good indication there's something going on there that shouldn't be going on. Right, so you want to make sure that you're getting the basic vocabulary down. Again, missing questions, misuse of vocabulary, failing to understand the vocabulary that's the most basic vocabulary in the class is a big red flag, right? So the next mistake, or that's fairly common, is much easier to understand. And you can understand why people, kind of more easily see why people might be making this mistake. But if you think about it a little bit, you'll see why it is a mistake here. And this one has to do with misidentifying self-contradictions in arguments. So again, I have a sample question here. What lines are contradictory in the following argument? And the argument says, premise one, if there are any universal truths, then everyone ought to be intolerant of cultures with moralities different from their own. Two, everyone ought to be tolerant of cultures with moralities different from their own. Thus, there are no universal moral truths. You might recognize that as a modus tollens form argument. But the incorrect answer that people often give here is that lines 1 or 2 contradictory. It's got a Q in line 1 in the consequent and a not Q as line 2 in the second premise. And so they're seeing, aha, there's a contradiction between Q and a not Q in those lines. So there's the contradictions. The answer is lines 1 and 2. That's where the contradiction lies. But that is actually a mistake. Let's take a look at why. So again, it's a modus tollens argument. We've got if P then Q, not Q, thus not P. That's a valid argument form, meaning that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. But if the contradiction was between the consequent in line 1 and the second premise, then all modus tollens arguments would either be unsound or have a false premise, right? So we know that all modus tollens arguments aren't like that. So that's an indication that we've got something wrong here. So the thing to note is that the contradiction is not between lines 1 and 2 in that argument. Q is the negation of not Q or vice versa. But notice that line 1 does not say Q. It says if P then Q, right? So 1 and 2 is not where the contradiction lies. It's not a contradiction between the consequent in line 1 and the second premise. Line 1 does not just have a consequent. It's got a whole conditional statement there. So again, all modus tollens arguments are not self-contradictions. It is correct that Q is the contradiction of not Q. However, premise 1 does not simply state Q. It states that if P then Q, or if the parentheses, put parentheses around that, help you see it as a unit, the whole statement is if P then Q. So the contradiction of that conditional is going to be another conditional, or at least a statement that's a conjunction that has two elements in it, both those variables in it, not just one. So the contradiction of if P then Q is it is not the case that if P then Q. That's the contradiction, right, of a conditional. And again, our original argument didn't just have one variable in line 1, it had two. It had a complex proposition. So the contradiction of a complex proposition, a proposition with more than one variable in it, is not going to be a single part of that proposition, but the entire proposition itself here. So a little chart to help us illustrate that. If P then Q means that if P is true, then Q is necessarily true. The direct contradiction of that can be stated that as P and not Q, and not Q, of course, is that Q is false right there. So the meaning of that statement is that P is true and Q is false. In other words, we've got to show that the if clause is true and that then clause is false in that. So again, the conditional form of that contradiction is that it's not the case that if P then Q, right? So again, it is not true that if P then Q is necessarily true there. It's not that case that conditional holds, right? So got to keep that in mind. The contradiction of a complex proposition is the negation of that whole complex proposition, not just the negation of a single component of it. And what we're looking for are contradictions, there's a difference, let me say it this way, there's a difference between contradictions and self-contradictions, right? So another thing to worry about is that, in our basic definition of philosophy that we've been working with, it's identifying and discerning contradictions among various beliefs. Well, you could have a contradiction between two opposing beliefs or viewpoints, like between atheism and theism. Both of those can't be true at the same time in the same respect. But that's a contradiction between two competing views. It's not a self-contradiction internal to an argument theory or a viewpoint, right? So a self-contradiction is internal to a single position, not between two different positions. So a self-contradiction might be generated by a single line that implies its own negation, or it might be more than a contradiction between two or more lines in the same argument or viewpoint. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of that real quick. So here we've got an argument. If any philosophical claims are objectively true, then they must be empirically verifiable. That argument also has that modus tollens form there over on the side. Premise 2 is no philosophical claims are empirically verifiable. Thus, no philosophical claims are objectively true. And then we might ask, does it contain any errors of fact, fallacy, or self-contradictions? What premises, if any, are self-contradictory there? And again, our two test questions, right? Well, here, the contradiction is generated by line 1, which, if true, implies its own negation, right? So again, it's kind of an implicit, it's not expressly stated there, but it is implied by premise 1. So if 1 is true, then not 1 is also true. There we get that implication of its own negation there in a single self-contradictory line. Then we got another example here where it's 2 lines in the same argument that generate a contradiction. Here it's between premise 2 and the conclusion line. So 2 says, or let's start with the whole argument. Again, it's got a modus tollens form, right? So if there are any universal moral truths, prescriptive truths, then we ought to be intolerant of cultures different from our own, with moralities different from our own culture. 2 is, but we ought to be tolerant of cultures different from our own. And then line 3 is, thus there are no universal truths. Well, if 2 is true, and everyone ought be tolerant of cultures different from our own, that implies that there is a universal moral truth or a prescriptive truth, namely tolerance. And that's the exact opposite of line 3. So here we have line 2 implies another line that is a direct contradiction to a different line in that argument, the conclusion line. So here we have 2 lines that are contradictory. So key takeaways here: make sure you know the basic vocabulary. If you're missing questions because of basic vocabulary issues, that's just a big red flag to me that something's going on there, either a lack of studying or maybe some issue that we need to get you some help with regard to reading comprehension. But, look, everybody in college ought to be able to teach themselves basic vocabulary words out of the readings, right? That's a basic thing I expect you to come to class with, that most of your professors expect you to come to class with. Whether you're really doing it or not is a different issue, but that is the expectation. Then the other 2 takeaways: the negation of a complex proposition or a complex premise is the negation of that entire complex proposition, not just a single part of it. And then in order to prove that an argument has a self-contradiction in it, you need to make the implicit contradiction explicit. So we're moving from 2 lines that are logically contradictory but are not the exact opposite verbatim wording of each other to 2 lines that are the exact verbatim opposite of one another, to make that explicit again there. Right, so I hope that clears up a few common mistakes that people make with analyzing arguments in class. Let me know if you need some additional help. Come by during office hours. Take care.